So good evening, everyone. There's a light that's just blinding me. But anyway, welcome. I'm glad you made it. You know, thank God there was no bad weather or baseball games that would interfere with your being here. So thank you all for coming. My name is Peter Aucella. I'm Assistant Superintendent here at Lowell National Historical Park. Been working on historic preservation and redevelopment in Lowell for 34 years. I came here in 1984 as the City Planning and Development Director, moved over to the Lowell Historic Preservation Commission, and have been at the National Park since 1995. Steve Stowell is here, I think. There he is.
I'm walking to the light.
Walking to the light. And Stephen Stowell is administrator of the Lowell Historic Board. Stephen, we'll let you introduce yourself so they know a little bit more about you as well. Before we get going, I've been asked by Paul Lappin of the Parker Lecture Series, who's hiding in the back, to, wait a minute, I gotta find the right one. Here it is. The next event in this series is coming up in 2 days. Thursday, October 25th, 7 p.m., Pollard Memorial Library, the Honorable Michael Ponsor? I thought it was Posner. Yeah, one of those. Justice in the American Character. He's he's a judge, and it's on the legal system. November 4th at 2 p.m., Sunday, right here in this room, Peggy Hart will be here. She's the author of Wool, Unraveling an American Story of Artisans and Innovation. So Sunday, November 4th. Okay, so, it works. So, all of you who are longtime Lowellians recognize this scene, do you not? And you can tell me which of these buildings are still standing. Because, I mean, obviously we're a town with a lot of historic preservation, and never would we tear down, well, we're kind of tearing down a bunch of things right there. So, actually, I'm going to give you the answer. And that is, whoops, what'd I do? Only the button in the middle. Well, now that's all we got.
It's a night scene.
There it is. It's a night scene. This is Lowell High School. And this is part of the boot mill down here. And this is, the Merrimack, Tremont mills, all kinds of industrial buildings that in the 1950s, 60s, Tremont mill, were lost. So I think we need to have a proper respect for what's been saved, but what's also been lost, because it's very hard. You just don't replace that, and it was really a critical mass of buildings that were lost. But I think there's still a critical mass of buildings there, and our goal was to try to restore them and get them into usable condition. I thought, oh, for goodness sakes, I think I'd better put this thing down. So I just want to show you a few before and afters, because sometimes you don't realize what Lowell came back from. I walk downtown and I say, well, these buildings are nice, and some of them are renovated, some of them need to be renovated again 30, 40 years later. But you realize that somebody had to decide to whitewash the brick and then put fake brick on the storefront. And, and sometimes I think that preservation is essentially a big striptease. Take the junk off, put a little bit back on the bottom, but on the storefronts. But thank God Lowell was a well-photographed community in the 1800s, and we have incredible resources to look at. As we look at these buildings, and again, painted and Really a lot of damage done to these buildings. It's the Lowell Historic Board that was created at the behest of the national park legislation. So Congress authorized the national park, authorized up to $40 million in capital expenditures for things within the park boundary. And I might tell you that we're well over 75 million in actuality at this point in time, the park being having its 40th anniversary now. But Paul Tsongas wrote into the authorizing legislation one condition, and the condition is that the city be responsible for an entity to assure that the private investment would not be inconsistent with the federal investment. And that's a great phrase if you think about it. Because frankly, back in the day, somebody could walk into City Hall and next thing you know, you'd have some egregious, sign or something that was inappropriate. So you had to have the city taking on a new role of policing itself, you might say. One of my favorite buildings here, this was like the bane of Paul's existence. He nagged these people so much that when they finally, and by the way, again, look at the whitewash up at the top, because somebody felt the need to cover over that pesky brick and granite and the metal that could go over the decorative brick, and to make it look modern. And so Paul was after these guys. So when they took down that screen, they actually chopped up a piece of it and put it in a wood-framed holder and gave it to him as a remembrance of the building. And he gave it to me. So it's in my office. So I want to spend a little more time on the bon mache because this is a good example of a lot of things. A lot of times we show you the pretty pictures. And let me step back. I started talking about the historic board, and again, what is important is that there is a design control entity. When somebody goes for a building permit, they're referred back to the historic board first if they're within the downtown historic district. Steve will talk about this some more. And then they are guided by literally 12 pages of standards. It's not a tome. They're guided as to what is the appropriate treatment of their building. And a historic board, historic permit is issued, which then allows them to take that to the building department and seek a building permit to do their project. So here we have the so-called bon mache building, but it was Jordan Marsh to most people back in the day, and this is probably a 1980s photo. So what Jordan Marsh did was, knowing that the retail world was changing, they had owned their building and they sold it to some developers from Wellesley, if I recall correctly. So the developers bought the building, financed it, and figured, hey, we got the building full of a tenant. What a great credit, to the bank to have a tenant occupying the basement and all those floors. Well, in 1990, Jordan Marsh became one of the first to move up to the brand new Pheasant Lane Mall. And so all of a sudden, these developers owned a big empty building in downtown Lowell that they quickly realized they had no idea how to get it reoccupied. So they essentially walked away from all the debt they had on the building, which was $1.2 million. Now, the Bank of New England held the debt. They held a lot of other debt, which is why the FDIC took them over in 1991. By the way, researching this, I realized that there still is a Bank of New England, and they have about 9 branches in the region, but they had 470 branches in the day, and they ceased to exist, I thought, at that time through FDIC. And Recall Management Corporation liquidated the bank. And So this building was up for sale. Some developers that from the South Shore that I knew from my prior life working for Paul Songus as an economic development aide, came up and decided to take a chance on the building. They got an option for $385,000. So the 1.2 million suddenly became $385,000. That proposal, as they worked on, I think they were going to do like everybody's idea of a Quincy market, a food court or whatever. I don't recall the details. That didn't pan out, and so they dropped their option, and it was back to the no plan at all. So Recall was going to put the building up for absolute auction, and what that means is if nobody shows up and you have $1 in your pocket, you say, I have $1 in my pocket, here it is, you win the building. Now, what concerned us is, and I will name names, because he was shall we say we were good pals. Louis Saab downtown owned about 18 buildings. And Louis would tell you, I'm a landlord, not a developer. So what that meant is he had no intention of putting money into his buildings, but he would let you put money into his buildings and have a lease. And if you made it, great. And if you didn't make it, well, you still owed on the lease. So it was an interesting financial model. So Louis, it was pretty clear, was going to bid on this as on the absolute auction. So if he didn't see much activity, he could have gotten this building for low money and with no intention of doing any improvements, but trying to lease it out to somebody who would have to do some improvements just to occupy it. So the Lowell, a number of the business and banking folks in town were very concerned about this. I mean, this is our largest retail building or retail office kind of building in the downtown. So, and it's a prime location, we needed better. So this is where I think we see a lot of folks, city and nonprofit, jumping into the fray to say, we can make this happen. And this is, I think, a great story of Lowell and partnerships, et cetera. So the Lowell Development Financial Corporation is a consortium of the local banks, nonprofit, and mostly they're giving out low interest loans to support retail, to support office or residential projects, industrial projects. You don't really see a whole lot of media about what they do, but what they've done over the years has been very important to Lowell and has helped provide second mortgage financing mostly, which is a banker can come in and be in the first mortgage position, but have that much less money they have to put in because the LDFC has more risk in the second mortgage position and is also offering it a lower interest rate to encourage economic development. But the LDFC also had another power that it had never exercised, and that is it had the power to actually acquire buildings. And so we had quite a debate because it's not an easy thing to take a building. There are a lot of costs associated with it, but they did that. So the Lowell Development Financial Corporation went to Recall Management and said, we are just a poor nonprofit, and offered them $150,000. So the 1.2 million became 150,000. So then the LDFC did three things. They hired architects to study the building and figure out what its reuses could possibly be. It spent about 50 grand on a new roof or major repairs to the roof. And then it spent about 50 grand on heat, electric, operating the building. So that's another 150,000 on top of the 150,000 they paid. But what they wanted to do was get this in the hands of the right people to get the right result. And what they did was they offered the building for $300,000 to Nick Saris and George Baracus. And for those of you who know, Nick Saris has a Saris Construction, great carpentry firm, he's owned a number of buildings downtown, has done wonderful preservation work. George Barakis, of course, owned Mural Pharmaceuticals, but has invested in a number of projects, included this one. So they figured out that it was going to be offices above, retail below. They were ready to go for that. They were going to split up the retail, so it was not one big area, because you're not going to get another Jordan Marsh. They put together a financing package on $6 million. And the $6 million, really, you know, you pretty much have to show some tenancies for that. So they made a proposal to bring, to recruit the school department, which had been up, let's see, no, they had been at 89 Appleton Street at the time, and which is now the juvenile court. So the school department wanted to move to the Bon Marché and be downtown, be part of the city. And some of the school committee members said, no, we weren't paying rent at 89 Appleton Street, and they still ran the building into the ground. No, we don't want to spend school department money on rent. And the city council had a very different view of that. They said, you're part of this. In fact, the comment from the school committee was, we don't do economic development, we're not downtown development. And the city council said, yes, you are. You're part of the city government. We're all heading in the same direction. And they really came out strong, the city council, in favor of the school department moving its offices to the Bon Marché. They did that. They later moved out, and guess what? They're back. In between, Wang Laboratories took the top floor. Let's see, the Lowell plan had persuaded and assisted, and I'm sure the LDFC probably helped finance, La Boniche, moving from what we most remember as Ricardo's, it's now the Keep on Gorham Street, was having La Boniche move in to a space. That then became Bishop's, and it's now Lowell Burger Company, but it's a great space there, but I know, you know, restaurants don't stay in business forever, so changes can be expected. And then the spa on the first floor was Anesio, it's now Indigo. Barnes & Noble, that was a case of the Lowell plan talking with UMass Lowell. UMass Lowell had Barnes & Noble as their bookstore, college bookstore. And the university persuaded Barnes & Noble to work with the Lowell plan, with the developers, and move an operation downtown. Now, of course, Barnes & Noble is no longer the university bookstore, so it was a matter of time after that they'd be no longer downtown. And now the school department has taken over some of those first floor spaces. But the point I want to make is that the building is a good quality. The tenancies came because the building is a good quality, but also because the Lowell plan, the LDFC, the school department, the city council, a lot of folks were saying it's important to keep this building alive. It became financially viable. The developers had the opportunity to get some low interest financing from Mass Development, which is a state agency, and they actually chose not to get that because the local banks understood who the tenants were, who the developers were, and gave them a better deal than the economic incentives they would have gotten from an agency. So school department now was replaced by CTI, which again is like an $80 million annual budget. They're a substantial organization. And then after that, the school department came back into the building, so they've got some first floor space, some upper floor space. But I wanted to take some time on that building because it took a lot of people to do a lot of things, and it took some believers like Saris and Barakis to put money up. And that kind of brings us to the warehouse part of the Bon Marché, which you might recognize here. And this is my favorite before and after of all of them. And I remember thinking when I first came to Lowell, if we succeed in renovating every building downtown, this one's gonna stay looking just like this. There's nothing that's ever gonna change this. Then I met Father Hervé Gagnon. Whoops, I want to go back to that. So this was the warehouse, and so Father Gagnon approached the Lowell Development Financial Corporation and said, I'd like to buy 10% of the square footage, meaning this. And the LDFC worked out a deal where 10% of the $150,000 purchase price. So Father Gagnon purchased this for $15,000 from the LDFC, put about $750,000 in it, and his vision there was that this would be a retirement home for priests, oblates of Mary Immaculate, who would then, because they were there, would volunteer in the St. Joseph Shrine around the corner part of their weeks, and that would help the church stay open into the future. So he was worried about the long-term future of the church. So he came to the Lowell Historic Preservation Commission, which was an agency, federal agency, created with the national park to help stimulate the initial rehabilitations here. And it went out of business in 1995, but before that had grant and loan funding, federal grant and loan funding. And the commissioners were very enthused about providing $150,000 in grants to the $750,000 project. And but the question came up about the legality of it, because it's a religious institution, and at the time that was a dicier prospect. So the request went in to the regional solicitor of the Department of the Interior. Can we make this grant to this group? And the attorney came back and said no. And the commissioners went back to the authorizing law, and it said, commission was authorized to make grants to owners of nationally significant historic structures located within the federally designated preservation district to promote historic preservation. And they said, doesn't say anything in our law about religious group or non-religious group, and they actually defied the Interior solicitor, which we don't do often, believe me, and made the grant anyway. And later on, in the, I think it was the first Bush administration, they changed the law anyway. So now the federal government can do things with religious institutions that we couldn't do back then. But I was always very, very glad that we took that opportunity, because I don't know if another Hervé Gagnon would come along who would take that on. And then Cherry Webb had that skin on it that, and again, you have to be quite a pioneer to want to take on a building like this. And I kept saying to them, well, if you've got an option on the building, can you go inside, reach, there must be windows on the inside, you reach out the windows and what is that thing made of, the screen made of, and can you reach it? And they said, well, we can't find any windows. Well, they took up, so at one point they said, we're just gonna buy the building, we're gonna rip off the facade, and we're gonna see what's there. Well, in fact, somewhere, Steve, you're gonna have to help me again, somewhere there are photos of the building when the facade came off, because all those windows were cinder blocked up. So you could not from the inside find a window.
Not only was it cinder blocked up, but there was vertical strapping nailed into the entire facade. Everything that projected was sheared off, and it looked like something out of, Europe at the end of World War II. And I'm out there on a Saturday morning with Nick Saris as they're taking it off. He's practically having heart palpitations. I'm like, Nick, we can fix it, don't worry. It was a mess.
So again, the city, I think, rose to the occasion here because they were putting out a bid solicitation for their employment and training programs. And they put out the bid. This was, again, Saris and Baracus, who had had a success at the Bon Marché, and said, we think we can do this too. And we were very glad to see them coming. And they put this together. They won the bid for employment and training, who was still there. They initially had, for many years, as you all know, Chantilly Place on the first floor. And it's been a little rougher since then, but they've had hypertext and now Purple Carrot there, both, by the way, with LDFC, Downtown Venture Fund financing. So, but again, a great building and a highly visible location that needed to be done. This is a Lowell Historic Preservation Commission project, again, the federal partner of the national park. And again, a lot of people don't remember that the park was a parking lot. And the H&H paper, which certainly didn't look like much, had, you know, what the commission did was set out to reconstruct what was taken off and bring it back to what it once was. Even the loading dock on the side had to go away. I mean, it's just an amazing change. And of course, you can see this from sort of a different angle where the stage is now. Again, parking, weeds along the canal there. And of course now the site of the Lowell Summer Music Series, my favorite place. So anyway, just briefly, you know, these buildings on Middle Street, the air lofts, these were buildings that the city acquired for back taxes. Took them years to be able to get clear title to these buildings, which had been vacant, open roofs with water coming in, lots and lots of pigeons. And it was at the time that they were doing, they had the first concept of an artist overlay district in the downtown. So they went and they studied Providence and came back and created the artist overlay district, which meant that this could be residential and an artist could work there. So you could work and live and you could sell out of there. So this was the first. And I remember, this is my recollection, that the units, a one-bedroom unit was $60,000 and a two-bedroom unit was about $120,000 when this project was first announced. By the way, many people were saying, nobody's ever gonna live there. Why would you wanna live there? And certainly not for that kind of money. And of course, as soon as before they were done, the developers increased the price multiple times over because the demand was so strong. So the city planning department, because the city owned the building, had to go to the city council for authority to put these buildings out to bid. And because the roofs were open, there was water damage, there was pigeon guano, it was a real mess. The appraised value, I think of the two buildings combined, was about $30,000. So when it went to the council, one of the city councilors said, well, if it's that little money, why don't we just take down the smaller building and then there'll be a parking lot for the bigger building and that will make it more marketable. And to the credit, to his credit, Matt Coggins, when he was assistant city manager for planning and development, said to the council, please let us try it this way. If it doesn't work out, we'll get back to you. But the whole idea, I mean, he understood, you want to keep your streetscape intact. When you go to other communities and you see parking lot building, parking lot building, parking lot building, it is not an enhancement. And you know, there's a garage nearby. I mean, so anyway, the council did allow them to do this. The developer did come through, and this actually led to, it was not long after that the Lowell Plan and the city brought in the Urban Land Institute to reassess what the plans for the downtown. What are the things we're doing, and are they the right things? Are we going in the right direction? So it was very brave of them to ask an outside organization to do this. Urban Land Institute came in, looked at this building, looked at a bunch of others, and when they made their presentation, they said, we think you've got capacity for 2,000 more market rate units right away, and several thousand more than that, beyond that. And in fact, there's been, I thought I wrote it down here, but In a 2016 report, it said there had been 2,600 new units downtown since 2000, and that was without, they wanted to balance out the income levels, so they were trying to get more market rate than subsidized. So it was not heavily subsidized, so a much better market balance. Okay. And then, you know, in the jam area, a lot of time, and again, the city deserves a lot of credit for doing the early garage, which was a garage that a lot of people thought would be empty for a very long time. But it's allowed a bunch of things in the area to happen. This is on Middlesex Street, and right next to Garcia Brogan's at the garage. And all those mills, the, I think Loft 27 was already there, but Counting House Lofts and Lowell Community Health Center and the Appleton Mills would not have happened but for the availability of that garage. So I just want to take a few more minutes, if I don't get the hook, on, you know it as the Rialto. It's the Boston to Maine Railroad Depot. So it was the trains would come up to the back of the building in the shed. After the shed was gone, you see in the 1974 photo at the bottom, there was another building in the back. That was where the movie theater was, the bowling alley. This was the first telephone exchange in Lowell, was in this building, so it was interesting history. It was proposed by the owner of the building to demolish it in 1989. And what they were going to put there was an expansion of the parking lot that had been created behind it, and my favorite phrase, a Victorian park, which was basically a landscape buffer 10 feet deep. So it would have been landscape buffer, and then you'd be looking at the back of buildings and whatnot. So, and at the time, the newspaper expressed a preference for demolition, and they said, well, who knows, you know, I mean, we don't see any likely use of it, and so, you know, it seems reasonable to allow demolition. I was head of the Preservation Commission at the time, and I think I was also chairman of the Historic Board at the time, so it was kind of a tough one for me, so I came out strongly against demolition. So Paul Songus called me up one day and said, look, you're my friend, the developer is my friend, I don't want to see you fight in the media. Can we have a meeting? So we get a meeting together over at the planning department. We sit around the table and the owner says, I don't want to fight, but I know that I cannot afford, I've done the evaluation, I know I cannot afford to rehabilitate this building. I don't want to keep it and pay property taxes, I don't want to keep it and pay insurance, I'll give it to you. So that was out of left field. I did not see that coming. And so I went back to the, you know, I thought about it and went back to the Preservation Commissioners. We have 15 commissioners. And I said, I really think that if you pull this building out of that neighborhood, that whole area has changed forever. It will never be what it was. And this building needs to stay in that area or else. So the commissioners said, well, are we going to take on every building nobody can afford to renovate? Because let me tell you, in 1989, there were still a lot of them, and there are some today. In 1989, the commission voted to accept ownership of the building. And then we came out of the meeting, and my chairman said to me, this is going to be a problem. This is going to haunt us forever. Well, the commission lasted 6 more years. I've had it for 29 years, okay, because the Park Service inherited it when the commission went out of business. So we pieced together a little bit at a time the money to make things happen. So again, those storefronts down the bottom certainly actually had been removed. So there was really nothing there. This was boarded up. So we needed to reconstruct all of that decorative granite and brick to bring it back to this level. I mean, you can see what it was, what it needed to be. So that was, I think, $200,000 right there back in the early 90s. Then Brian Martin, when he was city manager, approved a $100,000 community development block grant. Can you imagine giving a federal agency a community development block grant, which was federal money that went to the city? So just amazing that it happened. To restore the parapet, you can see that the detailing at the roof was gone, and it needed a new roof, and we needed to. All right, am I going the right? No, I'm going the wrong way. Sorry, every time I lean on this thing, I get in trouble. There was structural work that was needed. The windows and doors were put in, most of them with some money we were able to get from the Park Service. But I think the greatest accomplishment was the towers, putting the towers back on. So we had to design what the towers needed to look like. We got the money. I had a planner on my staff, Christina Briggs, who said, under the new federal highway law, I think Federal Highway Administration can give us money for the towers because they fund, an eligible activity is historic transportation facilities. And this had been a railroad depot. So, A+ for figuring that out. And we went in for the grant and got it, about $675,000. So we get all of that done, and what we have there is the greatest shell of a building, of an empty building you could ever get. So now what? Are we going to spend even more money, fix up the interior, and try to find tenants who would probably not pay us anywhere enough to justify all the investment? We had been working with Middlesex Community College, which had been looking to expand its offerings and saw the potential of this building for its performing arts, its dance and theater and music programs. And so the problem is, the National Park Service is not allowed to sell anything. Because think about it. If we sell this building, then somebody's going to sell Yellowstone, okay? There are a lot of people in a lot of states that would gladly sell portions of the national parks. We had to surplus it to the General Services Administration because General Services Administration could put it out, see if any other federal estate agencies wanted it, and then put it up for sale. Of course, there was a step in the middle, which is there's something called the McKinney Act that requires before a federally owned property can be put out for people to bid on it, you had to offer it to homeless shelters. And we actually had one that expressed interest until they realized how expensive this was going to be. So and the community college knew how to do this. They had done it with the Bradford Morse Federal Building on East Merrimack Street. They went in under a program called the Public Benefit Program. So there's a public benefit for hospitals, there's a public benefit for educational institutions. So they had to get the U.S. Department of Education to write a letter to the General Services Administration saying Middlesex wanted it and was the kind of institution that should get it, and they got it for $1. And Carol Cowan was a sport because she gave us $2. So anyway, we had, I'd say just a couple of things about this. The Park Service was able to play a role the private owner could not possibly have done. That private owner could not have renovated this building. We spent over $2 million to get a nice shell of a building. Not too many people can hold on, and it took us 18 years to do it. Middlesex got the building in 2007, then ran into state budget problems, didn't have money for design. I think Nikki Songus got them a grant that got the design going. And they stuck it out for 11 years to get what they have today, their academic arts center. If you have not been up there or in there, look for an opportunity to go, because it is a phenomenal accomplishment. So this would have been rubble 3 decades ago in any other city. And I think it's one of the things that makes me proud of what we've done in Lowell is we've been creative, we've used every resource at our disposal, and we've done everything we could to save a building and prevent demolition. I'm going to turn it over to Steve Stowell. I've probably talked too long, so Steve, apologies.
We need 20 minutes left. So, yeah, he also got rid of billboards, too. How long did it take you to get rid of all the billboards downtown?
There were 16 billboards in the downtown, and it took me 9 years.
Billboards were eradicated.
It's not there now.
No, that.
So as Peter said, I'm Steve Stowell. I'm the administrator for the city's historic board since 1994. And prior to that, I worked for the statewide preservation group, Historic Massachusetts, now known as Preservation Massachusetts. And prior to that, I was a park ranger from 85 till about early 94 or so here at Lowell. One of the things, and it's interesting, because I did a Lowell Walks, one of Dick Howe's tours earlier in the summer on downtown architecture. And the thing I always tell people about architecture downtown is that you can go by City Hall and walk a few blocks, and you can see everything from Lowell's first commercial brick building built in 1826, where George's Textile is, still here. And at the opposite end of Merrimack, you've got the Lowell Sun Tower, finished in 1914, which is a prototypical skyscraper. Incidentally, designed by Clarence Blackhall, who did Boston's first steel frame building. He also did the Wilbur Theater, that sort of thing. But in everything in between. So you have architecture downtown spanning, you know, your federal Greek revival into your Victorian styles, right down to a skyscraper. So it's really fascinating that a lot of this has survived, this critical mass of architecture. And one of the things that we've been doing at the Historic Board is that I'm hoping after the first of the year, I've been working on it kind of piecemeal. I don't like to roll it out in bits and pieces. I'd rather have it be done. Is on our website, we'll have a complete comprehensive guide to all of the city's historic districts, architectural styles, historic, period architects who worked in the community, and so on. And I guess I'll be doing a follow-up I'll do Downtown Architecture 2. I guess Dick's got me doing that again next summer. We'll do another version of that tour. But one of the things that's interesting is you go around downtown and you've got the public art collection and you've got other artistic endeavors. But I've always thought of, what sets the stage for all of that are the buildings, which is architecture, but the art that represents, the craftsmanship, and the respect for that is always something to strive for and something that we always have to guard against intrusions and that kind of thing. So, you've got a lot of art around here in the physical form of the buildings. But just a little brief about the Historic Board. We have development jurisdiction review in 11 districts, and I'll show you the map in a moment. And the core is the downtown that you'll see in a few minutes here. We have 9 board members representing a variety of public and private entities. Peter represents the National Park on the board. I also want to note that Dick Lockhart, our chairman, who represents the planning board, is in the front row. Also in the second row is Jim Wild. He's also on the historic board. So I don't think we're violating open meeting law by having a third of the historic board here. But Jim represents the city manager and basically historic preservation interest at large. But the other seats are held by like the Bar Association, the Historical Society, the Chamber of Commerce, and so forth. So it's a very balanced group that represents many of the partnerships that we have in the city. In addition to the design review responsibilities, many of you have probably been the Doors Open Lowell, and we've also been unveiling slowly, these downtown building markers, in addition to a very active social media platforms that we have on Facebook and Instagram, coming soon, YouTube, maybe Pinterest. We'll keep expanding on that. But we find all these public engagement outreach efforts are very important in, just informing people about what's happening, various projects and things like that. These are the maps. This is the map of all of our review districts. The core is the downtown. It's kind of like a coffee cup. You've got the Pawtucket Canal and Northern Canal here, and then the core of it in the downtown. About 5% of the city is in the downtown Lowell Historic District. So it's a small area, relatively speaking. It roughly follows the boundaries of the national park and the federal preservation district as the legislation intended. These other districts you see out here are neighborhood districts, and these here are more, I sort of call them historic district light. They're not totally soup to nuts like the downtown district is, from everything from signage, the windows, to new construction and so on. These are really only in extreme cases of demolition of a building or new construction. A little bit of partial demolition in the middle there, but it's mainly demolition and new construction. And really, these were put in place in '05 as the result of a citizen petition initiative. The new zoning code had passed. Some people saw that there wasn't enough teeth in terms of demolition and new design guidelines. And so out of our statute, you're able to do this. So they filed petitions with the city council to create 8 of these districts. And kudos to the public for taking that on. Now, I guess I'm supposed to look at some challenging projects that we've had. Well, one of the ones that was very challenging would have been the Appleton Mills project. The company itself was chartered in 1828. The mills that are part of the Appleton Mills now, I mean, almost everyone I imagine has been the Mill 5, familiar with Mill 5. Well, that's actually Mill 5 of the Appleton Mills, built in 1873. That's the oldest mill left in the Appleton yard. All of the other Appleton buildings were built early 20th century, '04 till about 1918. It did a whole systematic reconstruction of its mill yard. And that's what you see here is some of those later buildings. However, this was one of the good ones. Back in 2000, the Historic Board issued its approval to allow 3 or 4 of the buildings in the Appleton yard, the ones that were, if you can believe it, in worse condition than this, to be demolished. What was left was the remnant of, people see the mill wall remnant along the lower Pawtucket Canal. That was a condition of approval that had to remain. And then what was left was basically what you see there now, 1A, and I think Mill 4. But this was I remember this walkthrough, it was scary. Now, what happened was, Trinity Financial came along in, say, the 2009, 2010, to take on the remaining Appleton Mills as part of the Hamilton Canal Innovation District. And this was what are we looking at here? How many millions of dollars? $64 million project, about 130 units of housing. But it was challenging from the standpoint of, the condition of the mills that were surviving, and also the fact that, the Hamilton Canal is right below these cars here. That's the foundation for this mill. So in order to do anything, you have to somehow stabilize the mill walls and the foundation. It's all intertwined. It's a huge structural engineering issue. So what they did was, and it's barely discernible here, but you can see the inside through the windows, this steel frame skeleton that's supporting the walls once the interior was removed. So when you go and see those buildings, the entire interior was removed and the walls were suspended, and then the interior was reconstructed. So here's a nice before and after here of this, and here's the whole element there. And the other thing that's interesting too is sort of this contemporary landscape. It wasn't like, hey, let's recreate a fake old-fashioned looking mill girl mill yard. It was, well, we don't know what it looked like. Let's do something contemporary. And so the landscape architect did that. But we also did, if you go over there and ever see this, we had them outline here to here, the cotton house that used to be there. And then over here in granite is the outline of part of Mill 2 that was demolished. And within the granite strip, you have the date and the name of the mills. So there's a little bit of an historic interpretive element of that as well. So the landscape relates historically to the surviving mill. If you've ever been up to the Lawrence Mill Yard by Lowell National Park, same type of thing. That whole landscape is very meaningful. It's you've got wall remnants, you've got archaeological remnants. That landscape relates to what was there once before and the surviving mills around it. And that's the approach that we often will take with new landscapes in settings like that. But what I wanted to point out was this element here, which you can see historically was a stair tower by the ghosting of the stair there, and what it looks like now with the balconies.
But also this infill here. There's a reason it was done that way. It was kind of a solution to this unique condition. What we didn't want to do was create a false historic elevation with the architect. We didn't want to create brick walls and windows that were never there, because when this mill was demolished that was here, and when this was demolished here, it left huge gaping holes in the facade of formerly interior spaces. So we're not going to recreate a wall that was never there. So instead, we go with this sort of contemporary industrial panel approach that clearly is new, but respectful of the old, but it's discernible. It's not false or fake history. Now, another interesting project that's somewhat challenging is the Massachusetts Mills. Chartered 1839, it was one of the last of the original 10 textile corporations in the city. And what's interesting about it is this view here. It has all of its original four mills built between 1839 and 4041, but they've been added onto. So if you look at this one here, this is one original mill up to that floor. Forget that, and there's another one there. So originally they were gapped, they were separated, and as time goes on, they're infilled with connector mills, the top floor is added. So it looks a little different, but all four original mills are there. And in 1989-90, they were converted into apartments, rental units. However, what was left was the tough stuff. Out at the confluence of the river, the Concord and the Merrimack, so-called Massachusetts Mills 3, which comprised this long picker house building built in 3 stages, 1904, 1910, early 19-teens, in this boiler house power plant facility from 1909. It's pretty well landlocked in there. I mean, there are public safety aspects to this too. And the part of the problem, one of the impediments to this gain redevelopment was fire access, quite honestly. Various proposals, stop and start, nothing is going to happen, really, because you can't get access to this building here. So in these proposals, well, let's just tear it down, build a park there, and just rehab that one. So what ends up occurring is we meet with the fire officials, the national park officials, historic board, and we come up with an idea that, listen, if we don't allow some demolition of the picker house, we'll lose all 2 buildings, both buildings. So this section of the picker house right here, which was built in 1904, section 10, the historic board allowed to be demolished in order that when the fire truck can come in, it can access this building in a limited manner, therefore satisfying the public safety requirement. He had to sell it to the federal tax credit officials too. Part of this project was funded by historic rehab tax credits that's overseen by the Park Service in Washington. They don't usually like demolition. They denied the project. So the project was going to literally go down and, bite the dust. It was gone. So what I ended up doing, I wrote a letter to the people at DC at the tax credit office, as did the fire chief at the time, stating the case that if you do not allow this limited demolition of this section, we're going to lose all of the buildings here. They agreed, they reversed their decision. And so the result was this here. Here's the image of the demolition, and here's the end wall of the section that was demolished here. What was left was the other 2 sections, and this was able to get rehabbed with interior parking, and this is the section of the boiler house here that if a fire truck can come in, it can access with a ladder when that gets rehabbed, and that's going to happen in a few years. That will be happening. You can see another infill here, same as the Appleton Mills. It's a gaping open hole. What did it look like? We don't know. We're not going to make it up. Let's do a contemporary infill again. So the brick remained here, and this was infilled with the metal siding. And you can't really tell here, but instead of doing square panels, this was done with horizontal siding, and it kind of reflects some horizontal siding found on another part of the mill nearby in the same mill yard. But this is a case where, we struggled with how do we save these buildings and achieve public safety, and we were able to do both. Now, some upcoming projects that we've got. These 2 projects were just done a few weeks ago, October board meeting. This is 138 Middlesex Street downtown. And what you have here is the former Elliott Street School. Forget this, forget this. Think of a freestanding building right here. Elliott Street School, built in the 1840s, Greek Revival style. It's been mucked up a little bit over time. It's got an addition here and here from the early 20th century. It was last a school in 1889, and since that time it was commercial, retail, some residential upstairs. And the proposal here that's been approved is that there'll be 3 units of housing upstairs here, including 1 unit that the owner, developer, will occupy with him and his wife, and we'll have some renewed commercial space. We did what we weren't able to do here. Normally when we'll do design review of a project like this, we'll actually peel off some of these additions here, and meaning that the metal and the striptease type stuff, as Peter alluded to see what's under here, which aids in design. And we weren't able to do that because they didn't have ownership of the property yet. So once they have ownership, then we'll go in, we'll take some of that material off, and we'll begin to see a little more what this should really look like through here in particular and down on the storefront level. Another project that was approved back a few weeks ago by the board is 246.1 Market Street, right back here amongst the Canal Place buildings. This is the Bigelow Lowell building, number 11 or 14, I believe. And what's going to happen here is you'll have 13 condos up above with 13 interior parking spaces. So they're actually going to have these garage doors open, and you'll be able to park on the ground floor inside of there, which will be nice. Peter, what are we up to on Mills now?
98%.
Yep, 98% of 5.3 million square feet have been rehabbed. Now, the other thing, we're talking about preservation, but what's also becoming equally important is how we're treating the new construction proposals that we see coming along, because sooner or later, these vacant parcels are going to become more valuable instead of parking spaces as development parcels. We're going to see that across the street when the corner gets built on next to the Union Corner. Eventually, there'll be a building built with that long fences, Enterprise Bank. That's a development parcel. You'll start to see infill taking place and replacing some of the missing teeth throughout the downtown. But in recent times, for example, we've had the Tremont Yard project that originally looked like this, was demolished. It then looked like this. And this was actually a Department of Conservation and Recreation Mass DCR project property that they a long-term lease to a developer who then designed this piece of new construction. That this was all destroyed, pulverized brick. It was open to the elements. So we took it down to the foundation, rebuilt this here. So it kind of has this pseudo combination, historic and new blend thing going on. But you'll see it's similar in scale to the building that was there. It even has, if the doors open low, the subterranean features are still underneath there, and that was part of the requirement under the state to retain those and be available for public viewing and so on. I know the owner of the building has some thoughts all along putting some kind of a restaurant or function facility down there, which would be kind of cool, dining in the turbine pits and things like that. But you can see it's similar scale, similar mass, but when we're looking at new construction, what we don't want to do is recreate fake old historic buildings. And we've had this happen a few times. Well, why doesn't it look old? Well, you're not being true to itself. Other places do it that way. We've just taken the tack that we want the new architecture, the new buildings to be contemporary, but be responsive to the historic context in scale, mass, material, and so forth, height, and so on, and just as this one does here. Now, another recent building that we did a few years back, a couple years ago, was the new Merrimack Edge, or Edge Merrimack. I always flip it, I forget which way is which, but it's the private residence hall over on French Street. This is what used to be there. Merrimack Mill number 3, built in the 1870s with this signature clock tower that anchored the vista down the Merrimack Canal. You look at from Merrimack Street down, and that's what you would see is that tower. Well, during urban renewal in the 50s, that was demolished and replaced by this. But, I'll give them the credit. They did at least try to anchor the vista with the bump-up atrium and lobby area. The architect did, but it was just not out of scale, out of character. Then comes along the private residence hall developer And we work with them on developing, something in a contemporary industrial aesthetic. You've got, large, the window, the solid to void relationship works with the window opening versus the wall space. We've got limited use of brick on the ground floor up to the tower, metal panel. It's next to the boot mills. You can have your own opinions. Whatever they are is what they are. But we've not had really any complaints or concerns about this. People feel it blends in. They feel that it complements the boot mill next to it nicely. One of the things that I in particular really advocated for in this project, I said, you will, in some way, shape, or form, on this project, include a tower, just like this tower. And what they did was they built a stair tower, without a bell tower, there's no cupola, but it echoes the original bell tower of that Merrimack Mill. So when you look down the Merrimack Canal now from Merrimack Street, even though those high school tunnels sort of are in the way a little bit now, but you can see this. It anchors once again that vista like the old mill used to right there. But again, no one's confusing this with an old, fake, historic building. And the last one I want to point out is something that isn't built yet. And this is parcel 8 and 9 in the Appleton Mill Yard. These are the buildings I just showed you that were rehabbed. We lose the mic here? We have no mic anymore. Power went out on it. That's okay. I can yell. I used to run on the boats and trolley when you didn't have those built-in mic systems. Okay? So basically, this is parcel 8 and 9, the former site of the Mill 2, the Cotton House, the 2A, the Dye House, Mill 3. And these are the buildings that are going to be built on the site. You'll see the wall remnant is going to remain here, but set off from it will be these new buildings that are similar scale to the mills that were once there. There's even going to be a link bridge. This is the new bridge. This is going to be actually put in over the canal probably within the next month or two. That bridge is going to be lowered in, so eventually all the infrastructure work will be done. But overhead, the building will be connected in much the same way in old mill yards. Bridges used to link sections of mills within a complex. But the mill wall remnant remains. It'll become a private amenity for users of the two buildings, as it was always intended to be. It wasn't ever going to be a public walkway. That's on the other side, or the other many walkways that already exist. But this was just recently approved back in August by the Historic Board. And that I wanted to show you a little bit of the new construction, only because that's what we're seeing a lot of now. With much of the buildings that have been rehabbed, we still have some that need to be done, but we're beginning to see more and more interest in infill construction and new architecture as well. And that includes the new high school. We'll have an involvement working with the state through the reviews on the new part of the high school when that gets done on the opposite side of the canal. But I thought that was nice to kind of throw a little bit of that in, because we're finding that there's a great interest in this in terms of why things are looking the way they are and why don't they look old. So I guess that's pretty much about it. So, and we don't even need the notes. They're gone.